next of our studies in the End Times for Beginners series, and we have entitled this one The Seven Trumpets. In our last study we looked at the opening of the seven seals, and we concluded at the beginning of chapter number 8 with the last seal being opened and with a silence in heaven for the space of half an hour. Let's read in chapter 8 and verse number 2. I saw the seven angels which stood before God, and to them were given seven trumpets. And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer. There was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of saints upon the golden altar before the throne. That's an Old Testament picture. It's connected with the prayers of saints that go up before God, mingled with the flavour and savour of the sacrifice upon the altar. Verse number 5, the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and cast it into the earth. And there came voices, thunderings, lightnings, and another earthquake. That's the second one that we have read about. That speaks of prayer ascending, like we saw in the fifth seal. How long until there is vengeance upon those who have persecuted Christians? Now John says the picture is the censer is filled with fire and cast down. It's another symbolic picture of the judgment of the Lamb being poured out. The seven angels, which had the seven trumpets, prepared themselves to sound. They're waiting for permission from the Lamb on the throne. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood. They were cast upon the earth, and the third part of trees was burned up, and all green grass. Second angel sounded, and as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood, and the third part of creatures in the sea which had life died, and the third part of ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded, and there fell a great star out of heaven, burning as it were like a torch, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became as the wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were bitter or poisonous. The fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars. So that the third part of them was made dark, that the day might not shine for the third part of it, and the night also. These are strange readings. We'll not read any further. We'll ask the Spirit of God to give us not only blessing, but understanding in the things that we have read together. We're coming now to look at the sounding of the seven trumpets. We have seen the opening of the seven seals. That's a kind of legal picture in God's law chamber. The Lamb on the throne is unrolling the document of the title deeds, and as he unrolls it and breaks every single seal, so a judgment of God that has been withheld in patience and long suffering now comes to be poured out. The time of judgment has arrived. Then there was that half-hour silence in awe of what God is just about to do, and now we come to angel messengers. This is a military picture. There is a greater awareness from mankind down here, a closer link between what is happening in the chambers of heaven and what is happening on the environment on earth. Men will begin to realize, as they did by the time we got to the end of the seal judgments, They are not just natural disasters magnified. They are divinely controlled. The first angel blew his trumpet. I'm going to call that the trumpet of the burning storm. There was a hailstorm and fire mixed with blood. You say it sounds like the plagues in Egypt way back there in Exodus chapter 7 to 12. Indeed it does. Many of these judgments of God are actually magnified versions of what God did in judgment on the nation of Egypt because they had persecuted his people for 400 years before God set them free and brought them out. Mind you, God made a separation in the judgment because many of these judgments, even though they fell from heaven, they weren't allowed to touch the people or the cattle in the land of Goshen. God made a separation even back then. The hail and the fire mixed with blood fell upon the earth. And a third. You remember in the previous judgment the figure was a quarter. Now God is increasing the percentage. A third of trees were burned. A third of the grass? No. All the grass. You remember in the previous judgment with the black horse we spoke about famine. Wheat and barley being scarce. Bread and water on the table, no mention of meat. Oil and wine reserved for the very rich. I didn't say back then, but I'm going to say it here, no mention of milk. Milk to drink with your bread. Butter and cheese to put upon it. No mention of that in the passage. When we come to this judgment, we have the answer why. Because God has destroyed all the grass. Apart from the CO2 levels being tremendously affected, that means that the dairy industry has been rubbed out. If there is no green grass anywhere at all on planet Earth, there is no milk and there is no butter and there is no cheese. It will all run out inside a week or two. It is part of the judgments of God being ramped up and increased on planet Earth. Second trumpet judgment, I'm going to call it the boiling sea. John says, I saw that a third of the sea became like blood. John says a third of the sea life, small and large fish, died. A third of all shipping was destroyed. What John saw in his vision in relation to that would probably only have been connected with what we call the Mediterranean Sea today. To John, that still would have been a great disaster. When we ramp that figure up, and we're still not exactly sure how far it will be in the future, though I don't think it's very far away. When we ramp that figure up to today's figure, there are 90,000 commercial shipping vessels on the sea. 80% of everything that is consumed in the world, including our motor cars and computers and phones and all the rest. Consumables, perishables, white goods, so many different categories. 80% all moved by sea. 90,000 vessels moving that around. 30,000 great ships. All destroyed at once. You say, how does that happen? John says there was a great mountain burning with fire that was cast into the sea. Some people say it's a picture. It's a kingdom. It means that a kingdom fell down. There was a collapse of a ruler amongst the nations. That picture as a symbol could be true, but I don't think so here. I think it's literal. I think God is speaking of one of possibly the great volcanic islands of the Pacific. That great ring of fire that those of us that live on the shore of the Atlantic Ocean know very little of. People who live on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. Whenever I travelled to Canada and America first, I used to get confused because I moved all the way westwards as far as I could go, and then people said to me, "You're in the Pacific Northeast." I said, no, I'm in the Northwest. They said, "No, you're in the Pacific Northeast, because you're now on the shore of the Pacific Ocean, but you're on the eastern side. You've got to remember that Pacific is larger than your Atlantic. The other side is China and Asia and the Philippines, down to Australia and New Zealand. And right around that territory, Mount St. Helens in America, and the whole way around through the Philippines and right back round again. There are 160 large volcanoes, some of them islands and some of them mountains on the shore. And God could set a chain of them off. And the greatest of them falling into the sea could create a massive tsunami, which could sweep right around the Southern Ocean, round the world. Not only contaminate the sea, but cause a third of shipping to be destroyed. I think these pictures are very, very literal. If you look in your history books, young people, if you Google it nowadays, you'll find that way back in 1883, there was a volcanic mountain called Krakatoa. They taught me about it in school. You can look it up and learn about it. But one I didn't learn about in school was one called Tambora, which was an even bigger volcanic island which blew up in 1815. Back in those days, there was very little communication across different parts of the world. 1815, not 1915. They've since discovered, even from ice cores in the Arctic, the impact that that volcanic explosion, the mountain falling into the sea, had 200 years ago. The year following, 1816, was actually called in the history books, but they didn't know why back then. The year of no summer, the year of no winter, and the year of no harvest. Little tiny foreshadowings of these things that God is going to magnify, just as he will magnify the plagues of Egypt. Little things that have already happened in the natural world, God will magnify them under the authority of the Lamb's judgment in a day to come. Trumpet number 3, I've called it the banished star. Like a torch. A meteorite? We don't know. A fallen angel? Possibly. We'll see that further in the book of Revelation. Sometimes the book of Revelation talks about a star falling. It means a fallen angel, and maybe even that might be visible. It will appear as a star falling to earth, but it could be something very significant in the demonic world, and God is allowing the impact of it to be seen in our world. We don't really know. And how this word wormwood should be translated. Is it a proper name? Is it actually the title of a demonic agent, just like Abaddon and Apollyon and some of these other names that we'll find later in the book of Revelation? We're not very sure. But a third of the rivers and the springs were contaminated. Is this nuclear contamination? We've talked about all the things that were contaminated and destroyed. Now, a third of drinking water. There'll hardly even be fresh water left upon planet Earth. The fourth trumpet, I'm calling it the blackened sky. You say, what is happening there? We don't really know. But in the parts of the earth where daylight and nighttime are equal, there's great sections of the world where the time doesn't really shift a lot. And so it would be hugely significant for suddenly at once a third of the sunlight to disappear and a third of the moon and starlight to disappear as well. And in those parts of the world there is also great superstition still even today. They would be very, very fearful for a great part of the day and a great part of the night, and that might even continue for the rest of the 7-year period, that sunlight and moonlight and starlight will be lessened. In terms of what's left of the trees and the ground and the grass and herbs and everything else, that will still affect growth and production. In terms of the tides and the oceans and the movement of the waters and the lunar cycles, The moon being switched off for a third of its period every 24 hours will also affect that. And how that will be worked out, we don't really have any idea. God will control all of these things in his judgment. How is that going to happen, that darkness for a fixed period comes? Will the great mountain burning with fire, a volcanic explosion, the magnitude of which we have never seen before, will it actually be so severe it will cause a tiny shift in the orbit of the Earth? That's not impossible. The scientists worry about such a thing, so that the movement of the Earth in relation to the sun actually alters, and the circuit of the Earth around its 24-hour cycle also gets altered. And because of that, daylight and darkness change their percentages. We don't know. Will there be a dark planet, a dark star, that they're looking for today and they haven't found, and they think it might be there because they say they can see its gravitational pull against the other planets, but they don't really know? Will there be a planet that gives off no light whatsoever so that it can't be seen by a telescope? And will it move between us and our solar system and our sun and our moon? And will God use something like that to actually block out the visibility and the shining of the sunlight and the moonlight? We don't know. The fifth trumpet, we didn't read about them. They get worse as they go on. We're into the second half of the time period. I think of that, there is no doubt. And there was a star that fell from heaven. I think that we can be fairly clear that's a fallen angel falling. He's given the authority to open what is called the pit of the abyss. I think it's the same place that the devil goes to for 1,000 years. And it seems to suggest that that abyss today is not empty, waiting for the devil to go there. That abyss today has actually been for thousands of years filled with fallen ones, demons. And the descriptions that are in here are almost impossible to understand, but they're going to be let loose to punish men for months at a time with incurable sores and pain. John said he was able to actually see the shape and form of the things that came out. He said they looked like locusts and scorpions, the size of horses, with human-like faces. If John is drawing on his knowledge to describe something he's seeing, the picture is very terrible. Some people have suggested that it might not be demons, might not be fallen angels, it might actually be tiny little helicopters. That's not so strange a suggestion as it sounds. If you Google again and look at some of these things that America and Russia and China have, they look similar to the description that's here. The whole concept nowadays of miniaturizing machinery and having swarm warfare and things controlled by drones so that there are no pilots actually inside them, so you can make them smaller because you don't need crew in the cockpit. You could very easily finish up with something that looks exactly like what John saw 2,000 years in the future in his vision. And yet, I lean towards the concept of this whole thing being a demonic aerial army that God has let loose out of the abyss. The sixth angel sounded this trumpet, and something very strange happens. There's 4 angels, and they're bound beside the river Euphrates. You say, who are they? I think, let me stop here for a second. I think that God has put a good angel. Let me use that term. God has put a good angel who never rebelled, who never fell, in charge of every single country in the world. Every country has got its angel. Michael, who is the archangel, one of the highest of all angels, he is in charge, no surprise, he's in charge of Israel because they are God's own nation. I think that the devil, the dragon, has also put one of his fallen angels, likewise in charge of every nation. That means there is a great infernal conflict between the forces of good and the forces of evil. God puts in his weight behind Michael and his angels, and then good must triumph over evil. That there is no doubt. But sometimes God allows evil to have its way for a time period. Maybe these angels that are set free to do whatever they want under the dragon's authority are the angels that have been over, listen now, enemies of Israel whose land borders touch the Euphrates River. If you examine that on your map, you wouldn't have so much difficulty maybe working that out. Iraq and Iran and Syria and Turkey, which together form the old Assyria of the Bible. Those are nations today whose land borders touch the Euphrates. And maybe because this peace treaty is now being broken and pulled apart, first of all by the man on the white horse and then by other enemies who come in, then God will raise these enemies up again to cause great warfare and great trouble. The army here, be it demon or men, the number that we have in the book of Revelation in chapter number 9 translates as 200 million. In John's time, that would have seemed a fantastical number, that you could raise an army of that size. And to us today, there are countries in the world that actually could raise, if they had to, by conscription, they could raise an army of that size from within one country. Never mind different countries joined together. We step then from chapter 9 across to chapter 10 for the 7th trumpet sounding. We didn't read that. I should have said back in the seals that we actually stepped across a chapter. You'll remember that. We had to go to chapter 8 to get the last seal opened. And we stepped over chapter 7. Between the 6th and 7th seal, there is a little break. And between the 6th and 7th trumpet, there is a little break. And God gives us a little bit of extra information and material in there. Between the 6th and 7th trumpet, God tells us that coming into this persecution period, he has sealed 12,000 Jews from every single tribe of Israel, that they cannot be contaminated, touched, or persecuted. That is amazing, God's irreducible minimum. Between the 6th and 7th trumpet, God tells us, in a little gap again in chapter number 10, God tells us not about 144,000, but about two very special witnesses who are going to preach in Jerusalem for the 42 months of the first half of the 7-year period. They're going to preach against this man. They're going to tell who his true identity is, and they're going to preach about this one, Jesus Christ, Messiah, the coming one. And even though he will hate them with satanic hatred, he will not be able to touch them until the day God allows it. And then he will cut them down in the street of Jerusalem. He will forbid their body to be buried. They'll lie on the street in Jerusalem until day 4. He'll think at day 4 he's safe. Yeah, because even the priests and the Jews were worried that Jesus did really rise on day 3. By the time they get to day 4, he maybe even be thinking about permitting the bodies to be taken away and buried. Dead bodies lying in a street under the law of the government for 4 days. And then there'll come a voice from heaven saying, come up, and they'll come back to life, and they'll stand up, and they'll be caught up. I tell you this, that will terrify planet Earth, and should cause, if men were wise, and not absolutely consumed with worship of the dragon, and coming to the stage where they're going to worship this man. A miracle such as that in the streets of Jerusalem, Old Testament character again coming to life, should cause men to turn to God and worship the Lamb. Some will, but a great many won't. We step over that detail in chapter 7 and we come to the 7th trumpet. John said, I heard a great voice in heaven. I think again we're at the end of the 7-year period. And it said, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. And he shall reign. Here we are again, 1,000-year kingdom. He shall reign forever. And the elders worshipped him. And John says, I saw the sanctuary of God opened in heaven. I believe that is a real place. And there came again another great earthquake, chapter 11, verse number 19. That's the third earthquake that we've read about in the book of Revelation. And people are beginning to understand that these earthquakes and shaking and famines and movements and tsunamis and volcanoes and stars and wars, they're all coming from the hand and the anger and the wrath of the Lamb. And God is still, before the last part of this terrible demon worship period comes, we look at that soon. God is giving men a chance to repent. But they don't, and they won't. They would rather worship the dragon than worship God. Now let me give you the questions that we have for this one. This is number 10. We have been moving fairly quickly in our studies. We've got to 10 already, so I'll give you the questions for number 10, and then as usual for the younger folk right at the last minute, I'll give you the answers for the last one, number 9, the questions about the scroll. So, the first trumpet, when it was blown, affected what? You can give me that answer. You don't have to listen to the whole video over again, because of course you can turn to your Bible and find it in there. The second trumpet, when it was blown, affected what? The percentage is a third, but I want you to tell me what. The third trumpet, when it was blown, affected what? And the fourth trumpet, when it was blown, affected what? When the fifth trumpet sounded, what came out of the pit? I want you to write that down. You don't have to understand it. John didn't understand it, but John believed it. When I was a little fellow, about 7 or 8, if I wasn't really engaged in paying attention in a meeting, you know, the one thing my mum didn't mind was if I opened my Bible and started to read. I used to read the book of Revelation over and over and over again. I couldn't understand it, but I just was fascinated by it. I've always been. You don't have to understand. You just have to learn. And the Spirit of God will give you understanding as you read it more and get older. How many were in the army that we read about that were released at the 6th trumpet? That's a fixed number. You can give that. And then at the 7th trumpet, what did the voices that spoke in heaven say? You can find all of those things in the passage. Now the answers to what we had for the questions for the seal judgments, the colour of the horses in order, of course you can find that upon your chart, white and red and black and sickly green. How many seals were opened in total in our study? 7. What happened at the 6th seal? There came a tremendous earthquake and the great men ran into the caves and rocks. That was the next question. What did they say and what did they do? They asked the caves and rocks to fall on them and close them from the face of... That's the next question. Who were they hiding from? Hiding from the face of the Lamb. Who do you think is the rider on this white horse? Please, I don't want you to get that wrong because it's so important. Nothing whatsoever to do with the rider on this horse. He is false and an impostor. He pretends to be, but he cannot be because he worships the dragon, not God. He is Antichrist. He's the false Messiah. He's the man of sin. He's the lawless one. He's the prince that shall come. Those are all titles that we've used already in our videos. Why is his horse white? Because he's coming pretending to be a peacemaker and a peacekeeper. And also I suggested because other kings, at least 10 of them, will agree to give their power and authority and maybe even their crowns to him. They will surrender all of their authority to him. So that's the answers to the previous video. And I've given you the questions for this video And that has brought us to the conclusion of number 10, the study of the trumpets. And then in our next one, we're going to not go to the bowls, but we're going to stop here. And we're going to look at what happens in the very center of this strange black arrow that's in the middle of the chart, and this strange number at the bottom. We'll not even look there in the next video. We're going to see all of the things summarized that happens in the middle part of the 7 years, because that's how God showed it to John before he moved on to the pouring out of the third set of judgments, the pouring out of the bowls. May God bless you for listening. May God bless you in your study, and may God bless your homes and your families.